You can hand Mark Carney one thing since taking office as Prime Minister. He's made a lot of announcements. He's thrown a lot at you. He's passed a couple of bills, even, and he's made a lot of promises. But today we're going to do something very special. We're going to take all of the things Mark Carney's done and his so called accomplishments since taking office and dump them out like the contents of a vacuum cleaner. Because when he makes each announcement in isolation, in a vacuum, some of his decisions even look like progress, perhaps promises kept, perhaps efficiency, discipline, or vision. But when you scatter those decisions in front of you across the floor and you take a step back, what you really see is chaos, hypocrisy, and contradiction, and a trail of destruction heading straight for Canada's working families. Let's go.
Welcome to Bakes on Things.
Welcome back to Bakes on Things. I'm Chris Baker. Thanks so much for joining us again for a brand new week, and we are going to start with the $25 billion in savings. This is the one that's getting the most media spin over the last 7 days, where Mark Carney proudly announced that he has tasked his ministers with finding $25 billion in government savings over the next 2 years. Now that sounds fiscally responsible, doesn't it? On the surface, it actually does play like a promise kept. A leaner government, less waste, and more discipline. A politician finally doing what he said so he can go on vacation and wander around the Calgary Stampede and do nothing else. But let's open the bag and see what's actually inside. The vast majority of these savings that his ministers are going to go and find are going to come from public service job cuts. No question about it. This is a huge ask. And these are real people, real livelihoods, families working for the government, administrative staff, policy advisors, maintenance workers, immigration officers, passport officers, and others, all going to be laid off. Can you imagine half the people working in the passport office now? You'll never get your passport. This isn't masterful. These are Canadians that we rely on every single day. And here's the kicker. While he's gutting the public services in the name of these savings, Mark Carney has also still committed nearly the same amount, at least half of it, $13 billion of it, to a foreign government, one foreign government in Ukraine. Let me say that again. He's cutting $25 billion from our own people, our own federal workforce, hurting Canadian families, eroding essential services, and sending yet more than half of that abroad to one country. This isn't fiscal discipline. Start putting the puzzle together. This is madness. So let's veer off into that $13 billion direction, shall we? Because that foreign aid pledge is asinine. Carney's government is sending $13 billion to Ukraine in military aid, humanitarian assistance, and what they're calling reconstruction financing. Do you really think that's going to get paid back? Not bloody likely. Whether or not you support helping Ukraine is moot. The fact is, we are currently running massive deficits in this country. We are facing domestic crisis in housing, healthcare, affordability, and unemployment, as well as with our biggest trading partner. Canadians are waiting months for surgeries. First-time home buyers are being locked out of the market. Food bank usage is at an all-time high. And yet, the federal government finds $13 billion to send overseas, but then says, hey, cut $25 billion, including your staff. This is not about being anti-aid, folks. I'm not being that way. This is about getting your own house in order first before writing billion-dollar checks to someone else's. When your house is on fire, you don't send the fire truck to your neighbor's garage first. And then there's the 2% of GDP on our defense. One of Mark Carney's biggest international headlines actually came just days into being Prime Minister. Canada will hit the NATO target of spending of 2% of GDP on defense, and not by 2030, as originally planned, but by 2026. Then he went and committed 5% by 2035. We're not even going to get into that part. On its face, the 2% by next year seems like a strong and overdue commitment. NATO has been on Canada's back for years, accusing us of being a freeloader, while other allies like the US, the UK, and Poland foot more of the bill. So on paper, this looks like Carney stepping up, finally pulling Canada's weight. But here is the big problem. Canada's military was already falling apart at the seams, and Canada has no detailed plan for how any of this new spending will actually fix any of that. We need to start with the basics. Our submarine fleet, for example, we only have one operational sub. Our Air Force, it's relying on decades old CF 18s while the F 35 deal continues to drag on. Our Army, it's short thousands of personnel, with reports of chronic recruitment and retention issues. Many of our bases need equipment. They're all outdated and unsafe, lacking the resources to train, maintain, or deploy properly. And veterans, they're still waiting months or even years for benefits and care. So, yes, spending more on defense sounds fantastic. Let's do that. But where exactly is the money going to go? And how will it be managed by a bureaucracy that has already failed to maintain even basic readiness for our military? Even worse, Carney made this $20 to $30 billion commitment without ever tabling a new budget or presenting any clear strategy for how we're going to get this done. No roadmap, no procurement schedule, no reforms to the military's broken procurement process, and that delays even basic purchases by years. This 2% promise also didn't have to be accelerated. If we have to cut $25 billion from elsewhere, maybe we should slow this down. Look, it's not inherently bad, but in the context of job cuts at home, runaway deficits, and no transparency, it starts to look less like leadership and more like he just wanted the headline. Designed to appease our international allies, while Canadians are left wondering what gets cut next to pay for it to happen by next year. A strong military is important, don't get me wrong, but not if it comes at the cost of every other public service with no result to show for it. And then there's this weird pretending to support pipelines thing that Carney's kind of doing. Let's talk about energy. So, specifically, pipelines, because this is where Mark Carney's vacuum really starts sucking the life out of Canada's future. Now, I want you to hear me out here. If you listen to Carney's speeches, he'll say all the right things. It's no wonder the Liberals believe him. He'll talk about making Canada a clean energy leader. He'll say we need to reduce emissions, but also remain competitive in energy. And lately, he's even been flirting with language suggesting that maybe he supports expanding Canadian energy infrastructure, more particularly things like new pipelines. But here's the truth. Mark Carney does not want new pipelines. He never has. He never will. Period. Read his book. And if you believe otherwise, you're falling for the greatest bait and switch in modern Canadian politics. Because let's be honest here, Canadians overwhelmingly support pipelines, and Mark Carney knows that. Not because we love fossil fuels, but because we want to sell what we have to the world while the world still wants it. We want to be an energy superpower, not a country held hostage by activist talking points and bureaucratic stalling out. But Carney doesn't want to be the one who says no, because that will affect his ability to keep his government in force and, moreover, to keep himself reelected. So he doesn't want to say no out loud. So what does he do? He passes a bill, in particular, Bill C-5, a piece of legislation wrapped in unity language but rigged to kill every major infrastructure project before it ever gets off the ground. And you might say, well, no, this is supposed to power them through. But under Bill C-5, every project, pipelines, mining, roads, bridges, you name it, now needs the approval of every single level that it runs itself by. So that includes the province, the federal government, Indigenous governing bodies, and in some cases, even municipalities. Yes, it overrides some of our environmental stresses, but that means that any one group, just one, can issue a veto and shut the entire project down. Now, when you think about this, this is a brilliant political move if you're Mark Carney, because now when a pipeline proposal fails because of someone else, when the private sector pulls out or cancels the project, he gets to wash his hands and say, hey, listen, I put that bill in place to get this done. It wasn't me. It was the provinces or the First Nations or the courts or the environmental assessments or the municipalities or literally anyone, but it wasn't me. It wasn't me, Marcus P.W. Carney. I don't know if his middle initials are P.W., but we'll go with it. This is cowardice disguised as consultation. It's not leadership. It's not reconciliation. It's not economic policy. It's engineered paralysis built so that Mark Carney never has to say no, but always gets what he wants anyway, which is no pipelines, no oil expansion, and no economic sovereignty for places like Alberta or Saskatchewan. This is not just bad policy, it's absolute sabotage. And there's so much more to all of this. Let's talk about the smaller cabinet. Mark Carney made a big show of reducing the size of the federal cabinet when he got into power. He went from 39 ministers down to 29. Congratulations, Mark. He claimed this was a sign of efficiency, streamlining government and focusing on outcomes. But here's what he didn't say. He simultaneously created 10 new junior secretary roles, complete with staff, perks, and salaries of their own. Now, these junior positions are essentially assistant ministers, but they're assistant ministers with portfolios so vague that they could be filled by interns. So while he cut 10 high-profile jobs for headlines, he then sneakily, quietly replaced them with 10 bloated bureaucratic positions behind the scenes. That's not smaller government. That's just smoke and mirrors. That's just shuffling things around. It's flipping around the pogo stick. Who knows what he's doing with this stuff? And then there's the GST rebate. Let's get started on that. The first-time home buyers. Carney has also announced a GST rebate for first-time home buyers, which he pitched as a way to help young Canadians break into the housing market. Here's the problem. It sounds helpful, right? A little financial relief to finally get your foot in the door. But here's the issue. There are no doors to get your foot into. The housing supply in most urban centers is critically low. Construction hasn't ramped up. Zoning restrictions remain untouched. Builders are still choking on regulation and more red tape. So this GST HST home rebate for new home buyers, well, it helps almost no one. It's like giving someone a coupon for a product in a store that is completely out of stock. It's a policy designed to sound like progress while accomplishing absolutely nothing. And then we go back to the C5 area, these bills that Mark Carney has introduced, and we talk about one Canadian economy. Seems great, right? The One Canadian Economy Act that got fast-tracked even by the Conservatives. This legislation removes interprovincial trade barriers, expedites infrastructure projects, and it consolidates procurement to drive economic growth. Again, in theory, this sounds fantastic. Streamlined trade, faster projects, a unified national economy. But here's what he ignored. Things like Indigenous consultation. Many of the projects enabled under this law, things like pipelines, rail expansions, mining permits, all of these things will cross into traditional Indigenous lands. And consultation with those communities has been haphazard at best in our history, I think we can say. So reconciliation, though, isn't just a buzzword. It's a legal obligation, and this bill blows right past all of that, putting economic growth ahead of anybody's constitutional rights. And I'm all for economic growth, but not while hurting others. And once again, progress in a vacuum, disaster in practice. And here's the thing. He's gone ahead and cut trade ties with our biggest trading partner, one you really truthfully cannot replace. Another so-called visionary move that Carney announced that Canada would begin to reduce economic reliance on the United States. Well, he actually caused record trade with the EU in May, but that still left us with a $5.9 billion deficit. Here's the issue. Canada hasn't made any serious alternative trade deals. Yes, there have been some made, but nothing that can actually replace millions of trucks crossing the border every single day. We're not strengthening ties with India. We've stalled with the UK. We're barely present in Indo-Pacific nations and negotiations. So what we've actually done is weakened our biggest trade relationship with the US without being able to replace it with new ones. Like I said, millions of trucks versus 8 ships going across the ocean doesn't compute. This is economic suicide. You don't cut off your best customer, one that gives you trillions of dollars in trade, and then find a new one. Doesn't make sense. Finally, Mark Carney cut the lowest federal income tax bracket from 15% to 14%. And who doesn't want a tax cut? That's great for headlines. But the tax cut was so bloody small, it really doesn't matter to any families. But what it ends up doing is it actually doesn't help us fix the deficit either. So it really isn't helping on any angle. The $62 billion deficit this year is expected to balloon to nearly $100 billion when all is said and done. So, how does a government reduce revenue, increase spending, cut jobs, and still expect to balance the books ever in the future? The answer is it doesn't. He's not worried about it because he knows he can't, because he knows it won't. This is not leadership, folks. This is spend now, crash later, and hope you survive it all. So, let's empty the vacuum. Here's what we've got so far. So far, we've got job cuts coming that are disguised as savings. $25 billion worth. Really, Mark? And yet, we're still going to send foreign aid to Ukraine while domestic families are hurting. A massive defense spending pledge with no clear execution plan whatsoever. A fake pipeline policy designed to transfer blame and paralyze development. A leaner cabinet hidden behind bloated junior positions, housing rebates with no homes to buy, trade and infrastructure laws that steamroll indigenous rights, abandon U.S. trade ties without a backup plan. Like, this is a long list, folks. Tax cuts on top of an already exploding deficit. Listen, we want tax cuts, but they should be meaningful if you're going to do it. All of it looked tidy when held up one at a time in front of a camera, but laid out together as a puzzle, this is a disaster. It's a mess. It's a country drifting without any kind of rudder. This isn't leadership. This is management by headline. And if we don't start asking tougher questions here, if we don't start holding this government to account and stop sleeping our way through this government's term, Canada's going to need more than a vacuum. It's going to need a damn bulldozer. Look, if this episode is upsetting you, it probably should. I want you to share it with a friend. Talk about it in your communities. Don't let the spin cycle fool your family or your country. Because if we don't speak up, we'll all be swallowed by the suction of this government's nonsense. Thanks so much for watching Bakes on Things. I'm Chris Baker. Subscribe for more. Don't forget to comment on down below so we can have this conversation and stay real loud, Canada. We'll catch you next time.